Okay, so this is using query, June 1st, 2020. We had two items on the agenda, one of which was going to be a priority if a particular user joined us, and that was going to be like transforms and how to use them to scrape data from websites and make structured data sets out of them. But the first was talking about some of our latest thinking on user flows with respect to filing issues on Query Cloud, and how that functionality is something we're planning for and building for in the short to medium to long-term future. So I think we'll start with that, and if anyone else joins us, particularly the MKRLT person, whoever that is, we can pivot a little bit, but that's all I've got.
Fantastic. I prepped a little bit. I think this will mainly be a great chance for us to sort of like discuss the issue of issues. It's hard to get the language of this right. That's I guess we could say the issues feature. And just sort of like throw some stuff at the wall, because I think it's not so cut and dry to just be like, oh, cool. Like a lot of us come from engineering backgrounds and we're very used to thinking about issues as just being GitHub issues and some variation or flavoring on them. Today I just want to kind of dig in on that and see if we can't validate some of that thinking and use this as a foundation for some better proposals around what I think, or at least understanding what proposals we can make around this. I'm going to quickly share my screen.
So the things that I think I just want a little bit clarification on, and we'll pass all of these on to
what happened?
Wow. This number 11, all wet areas.
Nice. Okay, cool. Is everyone seeing a sketch thing? Cool.
Specifically calling that out?
There you go. Problem?
No?
Are we good? No?
Yeah.
Okay, lovely.
I think we can hear Margot, but.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Yeah. We, unfortunately, thanks to the coronavirus, my partner and I have to sit at the same table.
Of course,
and work at the same time. So you will hear some background chatter. I apologize. Yeah, so just looking through issues, I just wanted to pull some like really basic stuff to start with. I think we have 3 pieces of prior art that we should talk through, and just try to understand the types of issues that get filed, the audiences that are involved around issues, and
okay, great.
like what place up, sort of looking for opportunities for improvement for the notion of issues as they pertain to data sets and data in particular. So there's sort of 3, just taking a broad overview of the 3 types of issues, or three sort of pieces of prior art that we have. We have one from our own internal universe, which is Christos' Policing the Pandemic issue, where Christos is actually building a data set and just working on the actual sort of like construction of a data set in process. The next one, I think that we can easily spend the most time mining for insights, is actually the Johns Hopkins coronavirus data set, which has, at the time of this recording, 22,000 stars, 13,000 forks, and 1,300 open issues, which is I think it's a very interesting case study. And then last but not least, we also have just like the way that issues happen in the wild where they don't have any structure. And for this, we're just pulling directly from Chris's publication of a data visualization and a Twitter thread that turned into a, hey, what's going on with this problem? And then later on having somebody else pick up on it. Which is not that massive, but I think it's a really nice example of like, there are issues can come from anywhere. And they all sort of point to a relationship between a maintainer, in this case, Chris, and a data source, which is interesting, which is in this case, the New York City DOT, and then a third-party consumer who is sort of like, what's going on with the bump on the Williamsburg Bridge, which is this thing that was identified. So I think this sort of like lays the land. I personally would invite you to, I'll share this in chat, but this issue queue I think is the most interesting one for understanding or for looking at. Just because it's really robust. There's a lot of people filing issues on this coronavirus data set and trying to sort of like make their voices heard. You can really see some general categories that show up here. A lot of them are checking in with like, I am using this very specific part of this data set and it's not working for me. You see that pattern appear a lot. You then have these like three that show up at the top, which are these sort of like very interesting efforts on behalf of the dataset authors or maintainers to try and address a large question that they're getting a lot, or a sort of credibility question around their data that they have sort of felt the need to signpost to everybody that is at the issue queue. And I've actually screenshotted those just for posterity's sake. It's like, this is like interesting that the first thing that they're like, really, there are so many people relying on this data that when the data itself comes out is a massive sort of like thing that they felt the need to signpost when it was changing. And like, they're actually bothering to use like issue labels here, which is interesting because so many of these are just like completely unlabeled, mainly because you have a massive sort of consumer to publisher sort of ratio.
Sorry, it's actually called out in G.
And then the next one that they have is like, this one is a real data integrity issue. And if you sort of read through this one, they're talking through and signposting like, hey, that we need to openly address, almost in a README style, the distinction in the data between what we're reporting and what France is reporting and what you're seeing in other locations. And they go through like a fairly serious description of how they've arrived at the figure that they did and why they thought that was the case. There's like a pretty big, it's a very different sort of like questions for me as somebody who thinks about issues mainly in the sort of classic open closed sort of context. Like, does this get closed? Should in our universe, would this be part of a README? Like this, like, is this really an issue? Like, what is this? Would having more types of things that like count as social filing be useful or just confusing? I don't know. And I think the other bit that we don't see a ton of in this data set, which I find interesting, it showed up more in the beginning. I think if you look at sort of the New York Times' publication that's of their data, it's another like great example. Or people asking for data that doesn't actually exist. Looking for types of filing issues saying, hey, does anyone have, this is a time series. Hey, does anybody have this with locations? Hey, does anybody have this pricing index adjusted for inflation? Like these like classic, just like asking for data that is actually not part of the data set itself and ideally being sent somewhere else, or asking the author to incorporate some data source that they aren't incorporating in. That's like another sort of really common category that we're seeing a whole bunch. And so, yeah, I just wanted to sort of start with that as like, these are some things that I'm seeing a whole bunch when we think about the notion of issues as related to data sets. And I kind of want to just open this up to a discussion of what we want to see happen here. And I want to experiment with a sort of like somewhat new format for us, where we're actually starting to like build out a sketchboard that presents something of a visual RFC, where we can actually say, hey, this is how we're going to do issues. These are the key characteristics that we think they should have. This is even prior to a wireframe, but just like, this is how we think they should work. And they may include wireframes if that so helps, but like, I think this might be a nice, very quick and easy research document that we can point to as like how we think issues could be improved upon. So that's my opening spiel. I think I'm gonna quit screen share and just ask others like, yeah, there's a couple of ways we can sort of launch off this, but maybe that gives other people food for thought as a starting point. If anybody has anything to jump in with, that'd be great. But if not, I can cue some more.
That's just something I find sort of interesting. There's the difference between something that you want in an issue queue versus something that you want to actually live with the data. Right, because one of those is a cloud problem and an issue problem. One of those is like a query problem. Yeah, like something in the example you showed, something like how we find this data or how we interpret this data feels like it should belong with the data set, whereas someone saying, bringing up an issue or if there's a discussion doesn't feel like it necessarily belongs in the data set. So I just thought that was an interesting line.
Absolutely. And I think that sort of like ties a lot to this question of, Rusty, you had a bit. I just want to respond to Ren Fox really quick. That this like, you can almost think about that as being associative in two directions. If it's tabular data, one is being sort of like column oriented, and then one is being row oriented. Like there are folks who are just interested in sort of like the Fred stuff and need clarifications on the methodology of what is effectively, 25 rows in that data set. And so like, it's kind of methodology, but it's kind of row specific methodology. And like being able to cite that specific set of rows and say, hey, if you're looking at this and you're confused, here's why. I don't know. Then you also have a lot of folks who are just having issues where they're using columns the wrong way, where they're like, if you look at the Johns Hopkins data, there's like some people talking about like getting negative case counts, and it's them improperly applying the arithmetic between the three. And so like, there's ways in which there's like columnar arithmetic being applied, and there's the problems there, and then there's just like explaining why these rows or even this cell has the value that it does. And it'd be really nice if some of that could carry with as like this growing methodology section, but like,
Rusty had his little hand raised, and Asmer had his Zoom hand raised. So we'll go with Rusty next.
I got a mouthful. I've not seen the panned issues before ever used, actually. They must be relatively new. But if you're worried about issues as to-dos versus issues as clarifying comments or clarifying documentation, it might be handy to make a more overt pinning interface, from the top. And if you see a comment or a comment on an issue or a comment on an issue that belongs somewhere, you could pin it and it either be at the top of the screen or on a separate screen. As useful as closed issues are, not everybody goes back and looks at them. Chris commented that he solved problems, and I have as well. And I don't think I've really ever opened one that was solved and closed, because I'm sort of a read-only internet user. But I certainly could have, and I know a lot of people do. So looking at that from the beginning, if you think documentation is a big issue, that, putting that in from the beginning might be very worthwhile for Qri, especially as a different sort of use case.
Totally. Asmer?
Yeah. So along the lines of what Casey was thinking about referencing like the data and kind of like interfacing between the issues and the data itself, or at least my line of thought on that is I really would like the notion of like linking to specific commits. Like we currently don't really have PRs, but being able to say this version changed and it's reflected here, I think that's hugely important. Like you can reference like where those changes came in. Later on, we'll have like mini maps and diffs and all the fun stuff that comes with it, and that will just make it more useful. But just being able to tell in time when a certain thing changed and reference that in an issue, I think that would be really good. On the flip side of things, to GitHub, I think that, like on Git, you reference kind of like from the PR, and then you kind of like mention the issue, and then it pops up down there. I think here in the issue, we should reference the commits. So you have issues that are separate from the commit stream, and then you can reference them backwards. Like you just type the commit hash or title, and it kind of pops up so you can reference it. Mainly being we don't have PRs or merging of branches right now, and it's like, I don't know how we could possibly, like, it would be very cluttered to reference while committing a given issue, and then you had to add it, or we should add like a completely new like body type or a structure to the data set which would track.
Absolutely. I think the notion of like, and to that point of like, I think there's a question, there's an important part of ideally having an issue be tied to a specific part of a data, or like be a specific reference or section of a data set. So if your issue is around the metadata, and that and you by default file that issue against the head, and that metadata changes, it'd be really nice to understand that the thing that was being discussed is either stale dated or in some way modified since it was last looked at. That's an important sort of thing to figure out how that sort of moves. I think we can not worry too much about where we store that stuff for today and be more concerned about the UX. I really want to focus on like the audience side of this right now. Mike had a really interesting thing in chat here talking about GitHub discussions, which is a new feature that GitHub is rolling out. Mike, I don't know if you have a microphone, but I'd love to hear what you think about it. Otherwise, I'll share a screen and we'll have a look at discussions together.
I do have a microphone, but I honestly haven't looked at it at all. Yeah, so you know about as much as me at this point.
That's great. I'll share the link that I'm looking at right now. This seems closer to me already, just even at first sort of blush, to some of what we're kind of talking about here. Do you just want me to share screen?
Yeah.
Sure, let's do it. Share desktop 1, why not? Share. And
yeah, everything would be hand watered and on the screen. We're just showing water for things so that in these center boxes.
Where is
so
the
that
discussions? Here it is. I'm gonna move this chat thing.
The water.
So this is the sort of preview of what it is. We brainstorm future ideas and help users get their bearings and collaborate on best ways to use the software. Until now, in pull requests is places to have those conversations, but issues and pull requests have a linear format, well suited for merging code, not for creating a community knowledge base. They live on your project repository. They're threaded, okay. Huh.
I'm curious what they mean by like non-linear discussion.
Yeah.
Like, is it like Reddit style upvotes?
That sounds like
so.
that just sounds like threading to me. Like,
Yeah.
like, you can reply to specific posts, like Slack does. Like, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I see.
I see. I mean, Reddit's another example, but probably still time-oriented at top.
More like Hacker News, I think.
Yeah, post
Yes.
April 2nd, 26 days ago. Hi, everybody. Yeah, does it rank? No, this is still chronological.
Yeah, I guess both Hacker News and Reddit they reorder the top level based on voting, or a bunch of factors. Whereas this is probably
it's just saying it's threaded.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I presume you could permalink to a given thread and continue the conversation there or something like that.
Totally. 2662 issues. This is kind of nice. It's like.
Is it though? I don't know. From just some light reading here, is there an option to make this public, or is this? It says any organization member can participate. So that means it's quite different from a public issue queue.
Mm-hmm. I mean, panel, open source and public shell. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm sure. I mean,
you're not a member of that org. Post something.
And I'm looking at it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that it's posted and answered, and it's something as closed as answered.
I mean, yeah, this brings up I think about issues being for collaboration on, the team that's building and crafting a code base. But there is like a way for people that aren't actually doing the building and crafting to participate or start an issue thread, but it's not really for them. It's public for them to stay apprised, but it's not really, they're not necessarily involved in doing the work. When I think about data sets versus code bases, I don't know. I guess my first hunch is that most of the time we're much more likely to see a lot of consumers and one person or a very small number of people actually collaborating to craft something. But that, could be completely off base, and maybe that's what the world needs, is a way for 100 people to work together on something like this that doesn't exist yet. So anyway, just that's like initial thinking of like, are we focused more on issues from the user, user feedback and user like issue reporting, like bug reporting standpoint? Like it's mostly a tool for the consumers, or the more people that will be involved will be consumers of data sets. It of course connects them to the creators, but there are fewer of them. Does that sound right?
Yeah, to me, that's the like primary. I think that's really the rub of it, right? Is this question of you've hit on two major things, Chris. The like notion of like there's inter-maintainer discussion, and then there's this like many to few consumer to maintainer discussion. And I think that part of my concern is and I think that Johns Hopkins is a great example of like, that's 1,300 issues that would need to be manually closed by how many contributor? 6 contributors. 6 people are never closing 1,300 issues. That's just not tenable. There is no way that they're going to be able to sort of maintain that format. And that's part of my concern, is that like, if we look at, like, we didn't pull out, like, to me, instead of looking at GitHub discussions, we can just look at Stack Overflow, which seems to be like a closer, it's basically just moving some of the Stack Overflow style into, with threading into GitHub. That to me gives that audience a much better chance, or that the consumer sort of ecosystem a better chance to self-answer and self-resolve, right? Someone says, oh, why is this way? If the person who opens the issue can also close it, or mark somebody else's answer as answered, I think that's a really helpful methodology to make sure that, or not methodology, helpful mechanic for, some way for a lot of people to be able to sort of self-service. I don't know how that answers the question of maintainers discussing inter-maintainer conversations of, okay, how do I, like, it might feel a little bit strange to file a sort of threaded discussion style issue and then mark it as answered when the data is updated. Like, I don't know how that feels.
I mean, I think that's the cool thing about issues, is that they're extremely generic and you can use them for whatever the heck you want. That's why every team that uses them has their own style and standards and tags, and it's like, that's the first thing you need to learn when you come to a new dev team. Like, how do you use issues? Like, what's the etiquette on this team for interacting with these threads? But yeah, like what you said, you're basically saying, is it issues for the maintainers and the consumers together as a thing, as a collaborative, group of people, or is it, like you said, Stack Overflow, which is a discussion forum? I've long held the opinion that like discussion forums are needed on open data portals, and it can't just be like, the comments feature, which is not something you can like deep link to, and it's not something you can, share. It's not really a robust place for like knowledge sharing. It's just kind of little comments, and you don't really know who's going to answer them. But it needs to be its own thing where anybody can start their own thread. But how do you, managing that is going to be difficult, like you said. Is it the Stack Overflow approach, or is it the issues approach, where only people on the team can close something? Anyway.
Rusty.
I think, whatever you do for threaded or non-threaded or anything, you can make it sort of slightly more generic. And you could even do something like auto parsing, and if it comes up with a question, instead of being marked as an issue, it's marked as a question, and then the close turns into answered. And if it is either marked by hand as a question or automatically marked as a question, then whoever brought up the question can mark it as answered, because they know it's been done to their satisfaction. And none of these are going to have enough traffic at first to have 2 different places. If there are issues and questions on one data set, everybody's going to go where there's traffic. And if you put it all in one place, it gives people the flexibility to, hey, you know, maybe even set a flag that we only allow questions or we only allow issues, or stick them both in the same place. And then later, if there's enough traffic on some sites, it can be separated into discussions and issues, but it could be just a generic shove everything into one queue sort of thing. And, you know, the default search is going to be issues or questions or whichever, or even 2 tabs, and they all go in the same hole.
Yeah, I'm kind of strongly of the mind that we should try to strive for one format at first, A, just from like a bandwidth perspective, but B, for the exact reason that you pointed to, the idea of like having 2 paths somebody can go down means that now they're just like, well, what I didn't want to make a choice. I just wanted to find out I have a problem, and I'm like here for the usability of it. So I think it'd be nice to like start with one, and if we really see the need to sort of layer features onto that, ideally we can sort of like use that mechanism, expand the sort of functionality of it. I think Chris made a good point of like, if we just give people generic boxes, like we don't need to get totally crazy with the like way that this all works. It's just, it's more understanding. I think that the most important thing to understand is like, how does this scale, particularly in relation to maintainers and users? To me, that's one of the central sources of burnout in the open source maintainer side of things. It's just people getting inundated with issues that they feel that never stop and that they have to constantly sort of babysit. And I think that that's the chief thing, that if we were to ship some sort of innovation on, or at least have a design that naturally led itself, tended towards people like the maintainer not having to manually close things. As the default would be a much smarter sort of thing to think about. The other thing I want to sort of point to is this question of data that doesn't exist, or requests, like basically what in software we call a feature request, but in data set work often is not, like, it's just really not. If you are doing the work of publishing data, like you really had to decide before you went and found that data what you could possibly include. Like, I think it is the minority scenario where someone is like, oh yeah, situations I think like where our good examples are like where you're scraping an API and say there's like actually 10 things available that you could scrape, and you scrape 8, and someone filed an issue saying, can you scrape the other 2? And you go, sure. Almost everything else in my mind is like with coronavirus, like someone's like, yeah, but we need this, and we also need, you know, we really want this at the county level. It's like, it's not possible. Like we don't, that would be completely redoing the way that we collect this data. And so, but there are still nonetheless going to be a crowd of people who are acutely interested in county level data. And that's a different data set. And what I'm hoping we can do with Qri Issues is have that group of people find each other and move somewhere else clearly and cleanly. That to me is like a really important mechanic that I think that we should sort of try to prioritize as a first-class citizen of some sort of issue mechanic. Just being able to say, hey, signpost to any user that is looking at dataset A, but wishes that this unexisting thing existed. Have all of those people find each other and get them to sort of, if there's enough energy and attention, maybe they can figure out a way to get that data to exist.
Sounds like some sort of either bidirectional link or one directional link that is then surfaced going the other way. So I go to a page for dataset A and it's like, oh, dataset B, C, and D exists that are derived from this or similar to this, or, you know, and that's like algorithmic or something of that sort.
Yeah, I mean, that just seems almost identical to the existing GitHub functionality where it's like, you know, county level data references this thread in its README. Although actually I don't think the references in README happens, but references in another issue does happen. So it'd be kind of cool to be like, you know, if I drop links to a cloud issue thread anywhere in any, you know, any cloud related entity, it can like figure out where that came from and like trace it back. That would be kind of interesting. But yeah, I think it's like, you know, imperative on Yeah, I feel like, when you talk about that issue of like, oh, I need county level data, over the course of 3 weeks, that gets upvoted, 400 times, and the leaders start to emerge with strong opinions, and somebody one night decides, you know what, let's just do it. As long as they can as long as they can make that connection back and let all those other 400 people that have voted know, hey, there's new hotness happening over here, and you should come over here and like participate in this thread too. I think that would be huge.
Dustin, do you have a follow-up? Yeah, I think that's a biggie. And I mean, I think that's like in GitHub, that's a related issue. Or like when you copy and paste a link, you get that bi-directional link that you referenced, Dustin, where it's like, this is mentioned in.
Okay, now I do have a follow-up.
Awesome.
The thing
I'm glad
that
I managed
GitHub,
to bait you.
Sure, congratulations. The thing that GitHub doesn't do, which could be interesting, is like I go to the landing hub of a GitHub repo, and I don't see things like this other project is using this code, or like this is an alternative to like this repo, right? It's all within issues, which makes sense because that's more like the guts of it. It's tricky to do something like that without having it turn into like a system that's gameable, or spammable, or like keeping the results relevant and valuable. But generally speaking, I feel like the fact that our stuff is a lot more opinionated and has more information within our model is something we should like leverage, and like the way to do that there. It's very hand wavy, but I don't know. It's kind of the thing I was picturing.
I deeply agree. I think there's like some relationship between the browse side of this and the issue side of this, and understanding how those two interplay is weird and hard.
Actually, one more thing. Like Facebook does this thing where if you're in one community group, there's like recommendations for similar groups on the side. Like I mean, everything does this. But like, yeah, because we're more restrained, I feel like there's maybe a better way to do that without it being kind of annoying.
Absolutely. And I think we can get super fancy with that over time, right? We can start with, the basics of this is like data sets that have the same category tags, right? So keywords that match data, schema matches, great. Later on, getting smarter about realizing like, oh, these are both time series data sets, and one has a resolution of this, one has an update frequency of that. And just like understanding how to prioritize where users will sort of like, we see this sort of organization quite often of just resolution granularity, right? Like a data set that it does a monthly, some aggregate of, cool, this is how many people rode the subway this month, or this is how many people did this. And then someone says, oh, no, I need much higher resolution, and I'm very much willing to download the gigs and gigs of data because I want to get into the weeds and understand this at a minute by minute basis, versus users like, no, I'm doing this on a yearly. Like I absolutely do not need that level, and I'll trust in sort of averaging, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it'd be interesting. In an ideal world, we could sort of like surface those. A is related, then B as sort of like hierarchically related, but not going to happen anytime soon. Cool. So like, I think that kind of, I just wanted to take some time to explore and put some of the problems on the table here. Mainly as a thought exercise, but also as a sort of like way to inform how I think we should be sort of approaching this issue. To me, out of this discussion, I don't know about everybody else, but I'm leaning much more heavily towards like a Stack Overflow style threaded with plus threads. Maybe not plus threads, I don't know. Maybe it's at the beginning, it's just issue and answer. But I think it would be a lot of fun to see a proposal around that. Beyond that, does anyone have any sort of closing thoughts on the issue of issues? And then we'll sort of open up and ask.
I would just make a generic comment about a vote in the column of trying not to boil the ocean and think that we know too much too early, and build some simple functionality and see how people bend it and break it. And like, oh, wow, everybody's tagging relevant data sets in these issues. What they're asking for seems to be a way of linking data sets that seem to be related. Now let's go build that feature, as opposed to trying to read their minds and drive ourselves crazy. Esmer.
Yeah. So on the topic of issues, this is a completely different like whole set of problems, but I think notifications are a really big part of it, just to keep track of it. Like, I couldn't function on GitHub without notifications. Like, I know it's a completely different subsystem and ties onto a bunch of different things, but if I don't get that bell, like, little thingy, and I don't see it and I don't read it, and given like data sets can evolve over time, which are quite long in time frame, like you comment somewhere and then 3 months later it pops up, yeah, I'm gonna forget about it.
That's a really good point. Late joining point. Start over. Let's design it with notifications in parallel. But yeah, no, it's great. It's great food for thought. Hopefully, in the future, we'll sort of, in a future meeting, we'll sort of have a proposal that shakes out of this that shows some wireframes. I very much agree with you, Rico, on keeping it simple. Don't think we want to go. I don't even think the idea. That's why I don't think the idea of threading is like necessary. It's just like, what's the basic mechanic? And I don't want to just start with like a drop in, like open, closed, and like default to a decision that places a bunch of maintainer burden, where instead we could just say, hey, if you file it, it's like this. And maybe we instead just focus on a small and very simple upvoting mechanic. And move from that to notifications, because we think it's actually more important to just see everything you filed in the order that it's most recently changed than it is to be able to like put GIFs in the issue. I mean, GIFs are nice, but beyond that, thank you very much, everybody, for this. I wanted to leave some room. Mike, welcome, and just say, hey, how are you doing, and how did you find us, and is there anything you'd like to talk about in relation to using Qri?
Oh, I was sorry. You'll see me shortly. I'm on my phone. I'm just switching to my computer. But I was in the fission presentation. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So and Rico was pinging me this morning saying, "Hey, you should come to this." And I'm like, "Oh, hey, yeah, that's kind of interesting." So yeah, I'm here.
Awesome. And I think you had questions about transforms.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't want to put Mike on the spot, but he and I traded a few messages late last week about some of the things that were interesting to him on cloud and desktop. And namely, one of the things I'll drop in data feedback is, this is a very minor thing, but seeing search results, another vote for seeing a single search result of the latest data set or the latest version. And until that comes, at least sorting the results and bringing the latest version to the top. I don't know if we want to solve both at once or wait until we have a single solution, but that's something Mike flagged for me on our chat. And in the chat, he had also asked a few questions about using transform scripts for structuring data from web scraping, but I don't want to speak for him. Looks like Mike's ready to tell us what's on his mind.
Yeah, so I was just mentioning to Rico, because of this presentation, that you had a way to basically import or fetch data from a URL. And when I see that, I worry, because depending on what it is that you're fetching, if you're fetching HTML and then parsing through it with beautiful soup, you might be pulling down content that's dynamic and needs to be updated with JavaScript or through a JavaScript engine. And so I was just mentioning to Rico that it might be worth considering using a headless browser like Puppeteer in order to try and put the page more like an actual browser would. And so once you do that, then you actually have maybe the opportunity to include like scriptable sort of plugins for fetching specific data out of specific areas of a web page. And that could be something that's shareable between a community as an ecosystem. So rather than having to rewrite the same script over and over again, people could actually just trade in these little modules that go to a specific page and grab a little piece of information. But it wasn't really a fully thought through idea. It's more of a hey, if you try and grab something and parse through it, you may not be getting the full picture, or you know, every row, so to speak. So yeah, any thoughts?
Someone who's not me want to take this? I can answer this question, but I talk a lot.
I can say a little bit, having worked on our Beautiful Soup implementation a little bit. I think our parsing tools definitely are a work in progress. The idea of having something that's more browser-like and easier to use is something we'd like to get to. I don't think we're ready to take that on just yet, but I think it would be awesome to have. So I think it's an exciting possibility. One thing I do think, one thing that we want to have that we don't right now is like capturing HTTP requests when we're doing like scraping, stuff like that. You kind of get like an authentication then that like the web page that you saw is like, you know, the same thing that you see the next time you look at it, which helps a bit with dynamic behavior on the server side, not necessarily with like JavaScript pages. For that, we definitely would be something more powerful, like something that's imitating a browser. But yeah, there's a ton of moving pieces in this whole stack. And we've so far been like a little careful with like how we tread through this problem, because we know there's just like a lot of decisions to be made along the way. Yeah, that's my stance on it. Brandon, what do you think? Or anyone else?
Yeah, I deeply agree. I think it'd be really fun to get there. The way we would do it today, if I had to, if someone told us, hey, you need to ship the support for Beautiful Soup inside of, or not Beautiful Soup, for like using sort of the Puppeteer or what is it, Socket.io WebDriver API. It's popularized by Selenium. Like tomorrow, is we sort of wire up some sort of Starlark module that if you imported it and you didn't have access to that locally, it would fail. But basically, the reason I bring this up is to highlight the sandbox that we've created. And part of that is to really, it's everything needed to run Starlark code or Python, or the transform code is inside of the query binary, which makes it very portable. It doesn't make it safer, but it makes it easier for us to sort of grok what is and is not possible. It would be somewhat unreasonable for us to include an entire copy of Chrome, a Chrome automation API and everything inside of our binary right now, but it would be totally something that we would want to look at as like a later extension. I think the stuff that's happening in the Deno project is really, really, really interesting and really informative here, where we could see something like Query Cloud shipping access to a module or a specific special capability if it were running on cloud, or if you were running it locally and you ran it with our, we have a RFC for this. What is it called? Expose, with our Expose API, which would allow you to expose something.
One other thing that that you reminded me of, yeah, one of the things that we really want right now with transforms is that we want to have as much determinism and reproducibility as we can. So you run a transform script, it's possible to, like, you know, for anyone to run the same transform script and get the same result. That of course isn't always possible when you're dealing with external functionality. So we kind of have to like think about the definitions of like, what does that mean? And like, how do we work around that? I think moving things into cloud and then saying like, you know, you might not be able to reproduce this, but, you know, hopefully you have some trust in how cloud operates and you believe that this result that you can get was what cloud saw at the time you ran it. Yeah, there's a lot of really hard questions around how this works.
Yeah, and you just did kind of remind me that anytime that you are web scraping, you are sort of trying to grab information from a place that wasn't necessarily meant to be consumed in that that manner. So it's not necessarily, like, as you pointed out earlier, you know, you can scrape a web API, and that's a lot more direct and intentioned. Whereas, you know, go to this particular cell and grab this piece of information and stuff it into the CSV is slightly more roundabout. So yeah, I think you're already talking about some more of the edge of data as opposed to the core of it. So yeah, it's more of a food for thought. But one opportunity that does exist there is that when you do have a headless browser, if you are intending to provide that option to use Beautiful Soup to parse through data, every time I've looked at Beautiful Soup documentation, I've kind of cringed a little bit. The benefit of having like a headless browser in there is that you do get access to JavaScript, which is like purpose built for traversing DOM, the HTML, which makes it super easy, especially when you can inject like a jQuery or something in there, and then it becomes like easy mode. So yeah, it's I think it sounds like it's more of a long-term thing, but there's definitely an opportunity there. So yeah, it's interesting to hear what you guys are up to.
Yeah, the last thing I would say is we've been doing we have had a lot of projects that have involved web scraping where we have been scraping dynamic stuff. And part of this is just to highlight that the transform stuff really is supposed to cover very specific cases that work, and just using external tools should be totally fine when possible. And ideally, people are smart enough to document the way that they use it. Common pattern you see all the time, that we use all the time, is like just make a GitHub repository, put the code there, and then link to that GitHub repo from the data set. Now you have a data set that can sort of grow and be version independent of the code, but someone who really wants to do like a deep audit or potentially reproduce it themselves has a clear and easy, or not easy, a clear and a link to where they can go to start doing reproducibility work. That we see, I don't think that will never go away. Like we'll never, like Starlark and the whole like embedded transform stuff will never get big enough to sort of meet the sophistication required to do even half of all the data work out there. You just get this massive benefit of one button repeatability if you can do it inside of a simple Python-like script. And so our view on Starlark for now is like, it is, if you could make it work, great, totally not necessary. Hopefully that sort of helps set the context for how we're hoping that that whole aspect gets used. Cool. Well, I think that kind of covers it. Did anybody have any other questions about usability this week that we haven't covered? No? Look at that. We can give 15 minutes of time, 9 minutes of time back to everybody. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Mike, for joining us. This is really delightful and really, yeah, great. Thank you. And thank you to everybody for sort of humoring me with the chat through of the issue stuff. I think it really helps us sort of lay out the case for understanding some of the problems or some of the challenges in designing an issue queue for data sets. And hopefully in the future, we'll have something exciting to look at that involves actual images. But in the meantime, have a lovely week. And we'll see, our next call is on Friday, where we are doing a using query call, which will be far more oriented around using it.
Building query.
Building query call. This was a using query call. That's going to be a building query call.
Right on.
What do titles even mean? All right. Thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
All right.